Welcome back to the Emma podcast. I'm Eric, and today I'm joined by Anna. Today we're getting into a topic that's been evolving for a while, but now it's actually starting to reshape how studies are designed and executed, and that's the future of clinical trials.
More specifically, how trials are becoming decentralized, more digital, and increasingly driven by data. And what's interesting is that this isn't really a single shift, it's a combination of changes happening at the same time. You have technology enabling new ways to collect data, sponsors looking for more efficient trial models, and patients expecting more flexibility in how they participate. When all of that comes together, it starts to change what a clinical trial actually looks like.
Yeah, and it feels like the conversation has moved past the idea phase.
A few years ago, decentralized trials were more experimental. You'd see pilots or limited use cases, but now it's becoming much more integrated into standard study design.
Not fully replacing traditional models, but definitely changing how they're structured.
Exactly. And a big part of that is how patient participation is evolving.
Traditional trials have always been very site centric. Patients travel to a location, follow a fixed schedule, and a lot of the interaction happens in that controlled environment.
Once you introduce decentralized elements, that model becomes more flexible.
Patients can participate from home for certain parts of the study. Visits can be virtual. Data can be collected continuously rather than at specific time points.
And that changes the experience quite a bit.
It does, and that has a direct impact on access.
Because one of the longstanding challenges in clinical trials has been enrollment, not just finding patients, but finding patients who can realistically participate.
When participation requires frequent travel or strict schedules, it limits who can be included.
So when you reduce that burden, you expand the pool.
You're able to reach patients who might not have been able to participate otherwise, whether that's due to geography, time constraints, or other factors.
And that's important not just for enrollment, but for diversity as well.
Exactly, and it also affects retention.
If participation is more manageable, patients are more likely to stay engaged throughout the study. That consistency is critical, especially in longer trials where drop off can impact results. Um,
And that's where the digital side of this really starts to come in.
because once you move away from purely site based interactions, you need other ways to capture data.
That's where you see things like wearable devices, mobile apps, electronic patient reported outcomes, all becoming more common.
And the type of data being collected starts to change.
Instead of periodic measurements, you might have continuous data streams. Instead of in person reporting, you have real time input from patients.
That creates a much more dynamic data set.
And with that comes both opportunity and complexity.
More data can provide better insight into how a therapy is performing, especially in real world conditions. You're not just seeing snapshots, you're seeing trends over time.
But at the same time, managing that data becomes more challenging.
How is it collected? How is it validated? How do you ensure consistency across different devices and environments?
Those questions become much more important.
And from a regulatory perspective, none of those expectations go away.
Even though the model is more flexible, the requirements around data integrity, traceability, and patient safety remain the same.
If anything, they become more visible because of how distributed everything is.
Exactly. You don't have the same level of direct control that you would in a traditional site based model.
So, control has to be built into the system in a different way.
Through technology, through processes, and through how the trial is designed.
And I think that's where organizations are still finding the right balance.
Because the goal isn't just to make trials more flexible,
It's to do that while still maintaining consistency, reliability, and regulatory alignment,
and that's not always straightforward.
especially when you're introducing multiple systems, multiple data sources, and new ways of interacting with patients.
But at the same time, the potential benefits are significant.
Faster enrollment, better retention, more comprehensive data, and the ability to make more informed decisions during the trial rather than after. Um,
And that last part is a big shift.
Historically, a lot of decisions in clinical trials were made after data was collected and analyzed.
Now, with more continuous data, there's an opportunity to identify trends earlier, detect issues sooner, and adjust in real time.
which can improve both efficiency and outcomes.
But it also raises expectations.
Because if decisions are being made in real time, there needs to be confidence in the data supporting those decisions.
And that brings everything back to how systems are designed and how data is managed.
And I think that's a good place to take this next.
Looking more closely at how these models are actually being implemented in practice and where organizations are seeing the biggest challenges as they start to scale decentralized and digital trial components.
Because the direction is clear, but execution is where things get more complex.
When you look at how these models are actually being implemented, most organizations aren't moving to fully decentralized trials right away.
What you're seeing instead is a more hybrid approach.
Certain parts of the study remain site-based, especially where direct oversight or complex procedures are required, while other elements are handled remotely. That might include virtual visits, remote patient monitoring, or digital data collection happening between site interactions.
That approach gives sponsors more flexibility without completely stepping away from the control they're used to.
And it also makes the transition more manageable.
Because once you move beyond a single site being the center of activity, the structure of the trial starts to change in ways that aren't always obvious up front.
You're no longer just coordinating investigators and patients at a location. You're coordinating across platforms, devices, vendors, and patients who are participating from different environments.
And that introduces a different level of operational complexity.
You might have wearable devices collecting continuous data, mobile apps capturing patient-reported outcomes, telehealth platforms supporting interactions, and back-end systems aggregating everything together.
Each of those components has to function reliably on its own, but also connect in a way that's consistent and traceable.
And when that connection isn't fully aligned, that's where issues start to show up.
Data can become fragmented, timelines can be affected, and it becomes harder to maintain a clear understanding of what's happening across the study.
So integration becomes just as important as the individual technologies themselves.
It's not just about selecting the right tools, it's about how those tools work together once they're in place.
And that's something that tends to get more attention as organizations scale these models.
Early on, the focus is often on feasibility. Can this work? Can we collect data remotely? Can patients engage with the technology? Once that's established, the focus shifts to consistency.
Can this be repeated across studies? Can it be standardized in a way that maintains quality and reduces variability? And that's where processes start to matter more.
How data is collected, how it's verified, how it moves between systems, and how it's reviewed. All of those steps need to be clearly defined.
Because even though the model is more flexible, the expectations around data integrity don't change. Data still needs to be reliable, attributable, and consistent across the entire life cycle.
And I think this is where monitoring strategies are evolving as well. Traditional monitoring was heavily based on site visits and direct source data verification. With decentralized trials, that model doesn't always apply in the same way.
So there's been a shift toward more centralized and risk-based monitoring, using data to identify where attention is needed, rather than applying the same level of oversight everywhere. And that can be more efficient, but it requires strong visibility. You need to be able to see what's happening across the trial in near real time.
Enrollment trends, patient engagement, data consistency, protocol adherence, all of that needs to be accessible and understandable.
Because without that visibility, it becomes difficult to know where to focus.
And I think that's where the data-driven aspect really becomes central.
It's not just about collecting more data, it's about using it, identifying patterns early, catching inconsistencies, and making adjustments before small issues become larger ones. And that has a direct impact on timelines.
Because delays in clinical trials often come from things that weren't identified early enough. Slow enrollment, data gaps, protocol deviations.
If those can be detected and addressed earlier, it can improve overall efficiency. But it also requires clear decision-making processes. Because acting on data in real time means decisions are happening more frequently and sometimes more quickly. There needs to be a structured way to evaluate those decisions, document them, and ensure they're applied consistently. Otherwise, flexibility can start to introduce variability.
And that's really the balance organizations are working through, taking advantage of more flexible, patient centered models while maintaining the level of control and consistency that regulators expect. And that balance becomes more important as these models expand across more studies, because what works for one trial needs to be repeatable, it needs to scale.
And that's where organizations start to focus not just on individual studies, but on building frameworks that can support multiple trials over time. Looking more closely at what regulators are expecting in decentralized and digital trial models, and how organizations can align their approach to meet those expectations while still taking advantage of these newer capabilities.
Because the model is evolving quickly, but expectations around control are evolving right alongside it. And that's where things start to come together.
When you look at how regulators are responding to these changes, the overall direction is actually pretty clear. There's support for decentralized and digital approaches, but the expectations around data integrity, patient safety, and oversight haven't changed. If anything, they're being applied more broadly because of how these trials are structured.
One of the main areas of focus is how data is collected and managed across multiple sources. In a traditional model, most data comes from a controlled site environment. In a decentralized model, that same data might come from a device, a mobile platform, a virtual interaction, or direct patient input. Each of those sources introduces a different level of variability.
Devices can perform differently, patients may use them inconsistently, and data may pass through multiple systems before it's ultimately reviewed. So the expectation is that sponsors understand those risks and have controls in place to manage them. That includes validating the technologies being used, ensuring consistent data capture, and maintaining a clear audit trail from collection through analysis. And that's where things can become more complex, because you're no longer validating a single system in isolation. You're validating an ecosystem, multiple systems, multiple data flows, and multiple points of interaction, all of which need to work together in a controlled and traceable way.
And that level of integration needs to be clearly understood, not just technically, but operationally. Who is responsible for each part of the system? How are issues identified and addressed? How is data reviewed and verified across different sources? Those questions need clear answers.
Another area that becomes more visible in decentralized trials is patient safety oversight. Even though participation may be remote, the responsibility for monitoring patient safety doesn't change. In some ways, it becomes more complex. Because instead of relying on in-person visits to identify issues, sponsors may need to rely on data signals, remote interactions, or alerts generated by digital systems. That requires well-defined processes.
Who is monitoring incoming data? How often is it reviewed? What triggers follow up? How are potential safety concerns escalated? And those processes need to be consistent. Because in a distributed model, gaps in oversight can be harder to detect. And that's where monitoring strategies continue to evolve.
As we mentioned earlier, there's a shift toward more centralized and risk-based approaches. But that doesn't mean less oversight. It means a different type of oversight, one that relies more heavily on data visibility and real-time awareness. And that visibility needs to be supported by systems that can handle the volume and complexity of data being generated.
Because without that, it becomes difficult to distinguish between normal variation and something that actually requires attention. Documentation is another area that remains critical. Even though the model is more flexible, the need to document processes, decisions, and data flows doesn't change. Sponsors need to be able to clearly describe how the trial is designed, how data is collected, how it's verified, and how it's used. And that documentation needs to reflect what is actually happening in the trial.
Not just what was planned at the beginning. Because decentralized elements can evolve. Technologies may be updated, processes may be adjusted, and those changes need to be captured and controlled.
Otherwise, it becomes difficult to maintain consistency. And consistency is still one of the core things regulators are evaluating. Are processes being followed as defined? Are deviations understood and addressed? Is there alignment between what's documented and what's happening in practice?
Those expectations don't change. They just apply across a broader, more distributed environment. And I think that's an important takeaway. Decentralized trials don't reduce regulatory expectations, they extend them.
Instead of being concentrated at a site, those expectations now apply across systems, vendors, and patient interactions, which means sponsors need a more comprehensive view of control. They need to understand not just individual components, but how everything connects, how data flows, how decisions are made, and how oversight is maintained across the entire process. And that's where organizations that take a more structured, integrated approach tend to be more successful.
Because they're not just implementing technology, they're building systems that support both flexibility and consistency. And that's what allows these models to scale without introducing unnecessary risk. And that's where we'll bring everything together in the final part of the discussion. Looking at what this means long term and how organizations can build trial models that are not only more flexible and patient friendly, but also scalable and aligned with regulatory expectations as things continue to evolve.
When you step back and look at where this is all heading, it's clear that decentralized and digital approaches are not just temporary adjustments. They're becoming part of the foundation for how clinical trials will be designed going forward. But that doesn't mean everything becomes fully remote or fully digital.
What's emerging is a more intentional model, where sponsors are choosing the right mix of site based and decentralized elements based on the needs of the study. Some trials may lean more heavily on remote participation, others may still rely on traditional sites, but the overall approach is becoming more flexible and more tailored.
And that shift toward flexibility is really changing how trials are planned. Instead of starting with a fixed structure and building everything around it, there's more emphasis on designing trials around the patient, the data being collected, and the outcomes that need to be achieved. That requires a different level of coordination.
Because once you move away from a single centralized environment, you're managing more variables, more systems, more interactions, and more points where things need to align. And that's where consistency becomes critical. Not in the sense of making everything rigid, but in making sure that processes are clearly defined and applied in a way that holds up across different parts of the trial.
That includes how data is collected, how it's verified, how it moves between systems, and how decisions are made based on that data. And as these models scale, that consistency becomes even more important because what works for one study needs to be repeatable across others.
It needs to be something that can be applied across different therapeutic areas, different patient populations, and different levels of complexity. And that's where organizations start to shift from focusing on individual trials to building broader frameworks. Frameworks that define how decentralized elements are implemented, how digital tools are validated, and how data is managed across the life cycle. Those frameworks don't eliminate complexity, but they make it manageable.
They provide a structure that supports both flexibility and control. And that's really the balance that defines the future of clinical trials, not just adopting new technologies, but integrating them in a way that maintains trust in the data and the outcomes. Because at the end of the day, that's what everything comes back to.
Confidence in how the trial was conducted, confidence in the data that was collected, and confidence in the conclusions that are drawn from it. And when you take all of this together, the direction is pretty clear. Clinical trials are becoming more flexible, more patient-centered, and more data-driven. But the expectations around control, consistency, and reliability are not changing. If anything, they're becoming more visible as these models expand.
What's shifting is how those expectations are applied. Instead of being concentrated at a physical site, they're now distributed across systems, technologies, and patient interactions. That means sponsors need a broader view of how trials are designed, how data flows, and how oversight is maintained across the entire process, and that's where structure becomes critical. Not to limit flexibility, but to support it.
Because without a clear framework, decentralized elements can introduce variability that's difficult to manage. With the right structure in place, that same flexibility becomes an advantage. It allows organizations to improve access, increase efficiency, and make more informed decisions throughout the trial. And I think that's the key takeaway. This isn't about replacing traditional models or adopting new technology for the sake of it. It's about evolving how trials are conducted in a way that maintains trust in the data and the outcomes.
Organizations that approach this thoughtfully with a focus on integration, visibility, and consistency are going to be in a much stronger position moving forward. Because at the end of the day, the success of any clinical trial still comes down to confidence.
Confidence in how the study was designed, how the data was collected, and how the results can be interpreted. And that doesn't change, even as the model itself evolves. Thank you for joining us for today's deep dive. If your organization needs support designing decentralized trial models, strengthening data integrity, or aligning clinical operations with regulatory expectations, Emma International is here to help. You can reach us anytime at info@emmainternational.com or visit us at emmainternational.com.
Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and Spotify so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay innovative.